Thank you so much. It's such an honor to be here today. And it's so wonderful to open with genetics, something that I am super passionate about. I went and saw a cancer genetic counselor. I'm a bilateral survivor, as she said. And I went 16, 17 years ago and had some genetic counseling to find out more about my genetics as a bilateral survivor. And I was so enthralled with the information and a little upset at the same time. And I felt like this was so important to be able to help people to understand a very, very important piece of who they are. And it's not just retinoblastoma for me anymore, but I do feel like this is a great way to start. It's such foundational information and something that I am so, as I said, so passionate about. And I'm super excited for our wonderful panel that we have here today. So I'll briefly introduce myself. I'm on the list here first. So I'm a bilateral survivor. I'm on the board, as you heard. I live in Menlo Park, California. I work at Stanford Children's in the perinatal genetics. I'm a relief counselor there. And I love playing outside. California weather's pretty great after growing up in Massachusetts. And then I love playing outside with my 10-year-old twins, my rescue dog, and my husband, Doug, who is holding down the fort while I'm here. So thank you, Doug. And then I also wanted to introduce Pernille Axél Gregersen. She is MD, Ph.D, and the chief physician at Aarhus University Hospital. Hopefully you can say that better than I do when you come up here. And she's here today with her husband, father, and 3 wonderful children who I got to meet on the bus tour yesterday. And our children are volunteering in the Child Life program right now, so they are amazing and get an extra gold star. And then last but not least, we have Molly McGuinness, who has the job that I thought I wanted way back in the day. She works at Stanford Children's as a genetic counselor in pediatric oncology. And she was kind enough to accept my invitation to come here today. And we are thrilled to have her. And some fun facts about her is that she loves living in San Francisco, exploring there, and also weightlifting and doing Pilates. So welcome to our panelists here, and I'm gonna pass it off right now to Pernille. Okay.
Thank you very much. You can hear me with my Danish accent. So my goal for the next minutes is to try to make genetics of retinoblastoma simple. And please feel free to come and ask questions in breaks, etc. I think that applies to all of us because we are here to learn from each other. And you said the name very fine, so no need to adjust that. And
it's not going to be on there. So this, it's going to be right.
Okay, I'm not going to talk about bicycling. I don't expect you guys to know this guy, but every day knows him because he won Tour de France, the very prestigious bike race in Europe every year. He won it last year. I'm showing you this photo because I want you to notice important part of the photo. What is most important on a bike besides the rider? That is 2 well-functioning brakes, the hand brakes. So when we're talking about retinoblastoma and the RB1 gene, think about them as brakes. I will get back to that. It's extremely simplified, but keep that in the memory, and then we have a common language. Before genetic testing, we could only look on what we as geneticists call the phenotype, the clinical presentation, to decide whether could this be heritable or non-heritable. So very simplified, when a child had a tumor, 1 tumor in 1 eye, it would be non-heritable retinoblastoma. But if there was a tumor in both eyes or multiple tumors in 1 eye, we would refer to this as heritable retinoblastoma. Today, as Sandra mentioned with the history, this is not as simple as we thought, because approximately 18% of individuals, patients with unilateral retinoblastoma actually have heritable retinoblastoma. We also know something called mosaicism. To many, that's a tricky concept, but it actually just means that the genetic mutation, the genetic alteration, is only present in a fraction of the cells in the body. That means it can be more difficult to predict what is the risk to offspring, what is the risk for second cancer, etc. But very interesting for me as a genetic concept. Then we know that heritable retinoblastoma most often is the result of a new mutation in the retinoblastoma gene, but of course it can be inherited from an affected father or mother. We know that there's this more rare case of sporadic retinoblastoma caused by a gene called McGuinness. It is extremely rare, but we see it even in Denmark, where we have very few patients a year, few new patients a year. So genetic testing, as you can see from the first 4 lines, is extremely important, and we need to use it where available to clarify heritability. So to understand the genetics, I have tried to make this, for many of you, well-known image to see or to illustrate what's going on in non-heritable retinoblastoma. So on the left, you see, can I actually? No. So on the left, you can see the green cells. Those are all normal cells. Then something happens. The first mutational event, that is the first red dot on the bottom, that is the first thing that has to happen before a tumor can develop. A second mutation happens, and then tumor growth starts. Again, this is very simplified because a lot of other stuff is going on, but think about this as the breaks. So as you can see on the first, can I use a pointer here, or? No, you see it? I'm not sure I can point, but you can see the breaks there. And from the beginning, you have 2 normal functioning breaks. Then one is broken. There's only one working break left. That's okay. But when that is broken, you have uncontrolled tumor growth. The retinoblastoma tumor can develop. In heritable retinoblastoma, one break is already broken. So there's only one normal functioning break left. So the road to developing a tumor is shorter. You can see the break here. And also, as Sandra said, this work was actually attributed, or the understanding of this 2-hit hypothesis, the 2 breaks that needs to be broken, was described by Alfred Knudson back in the days, years before the gene actually was identified. This is just to sum up what I just went over. So on the top line, you see the normal cells in non-heritable retinoblastoma. One mutation occurs, that's the first hit. The second mutation occurs, the second hit, and then retinoblastoma develops locally in the eye. But in heritable retinoblastoma, the road to developing a tumor is shorter because the first mutation, the first hit, is already there. And of course, that is also the cause of the unfortunate high risk of second cancer developing later on, of risk for second cancer. Again, you can see the breaks. They're perfectly working normal from the start in the non-heritable retinoblastoma, but one is broken in heritable retinoblastoma. And this is just another way to try to simplify when we look at retinoblastoma in another view or another perspective. As I mentioned from the beginning, we can have the unilateral tumor, or we can have bilateral multifocal tumor. And we know that the gray area here is where we see the genetic mutation in the RB1 gene. So we would expect to find a mutation in the majority of these gray cases because we actually have a high sensitivity of the genetic testing. The mosaicism is somewhere in between, and again, the clinical phenotype depends on the amount of mutation-bearing cells in the body. And this is just what I mentioned about the McGuinness amplification in a rare case of non-heritable retinoblastoma. So, about the RB1 gene, I told you this should be very basic. So just to refresh, we all have 2 versions of all chromosomes. We have 2 versions of all our genes. I refer to the chromosomes as our bookshelves. So we inherit one from mom and one from dad. And on these bookshelves, we have all the genes. Those are books. So we also have 2 RB1 genes, one from mom and one from dad. The bookshelf is numbered 13, so on chromosome 13, we have the RB1 gene. And all of us have 2 RB1 genes. Some has a mutation in one of them in all the cells of the body. Those would be the patients and survivors with heritable retinoblastoma. And as Sandra also mentioned, the tumor suppressor function of the RB1 gene is what is really the problem. That's what's wrong here. We have a malfunctioning tumor suppressor gene. And what is a tumor suppressor gene? As the word says, it's a gene that holds down tumor growth. So it is actually a brake, and that brake is making the cells grow with a normal rate. If the brakes are not working, there's uncontrolled cell growth, and a tumor develops. Again, a very simplified model, because a lot of other local factors should be happening for a tumor to develop. But that is like the basic of it. If you have inherited the retinoblastoma gene or altered retinoblastoma gene, that's a 50% risk of doing that or passing it on. That's what we refer to as autosomal dominant inheritance. But on a cellular level, both genes need the mutation. So on a functional level, we refer to it as autosomal recessive inheritance. There is a difference in the severity of the condition depending on what kind of alteration you have in the RB1 gene. Usually, an alteration in the RB gene has a high impact, what we refer to as high penetrance. It's approximately 95%, so a high risk of developing retinoblastoma if you have an RB1 alterations. But you can also see families with low penetrance RB1 mutations. For example, I have a pedigree here. It's very small, but it's a Danish family with a boy who had retinoblastoma in one eye, and we found that actually another 10 family members had the same RB1 alteration without having any signs of retinoblastoma. So that's a family with extremely low penetrance retinoblastoma. And of course, in families with this or other kind of low penetrance alterations, the management should be altered, the counseling should be altered. So we are hoping for future better and more tailored management of everyone with heritable retinoblastoma, because there is something we still don't understand fully about this so-called genotype-phenotype correlations. But it would be amazing if we, from looking at the specific RB1 alteration, could tailor your treatment. Is there a reason to be more vigilant to second primary cancers, or could we be a little less vigilant? So talking about heritable retinoblastoma, I very often get the question from parents that say, how can this be heritable? Because we don't have it as parents, we are healthy. And that's because that child is the first one with heritable retinoblastoma. So on this pedigree, you see a boy with the arrow. He's the first one to have retinoblastoma and have the RB1 gene mutation. Compared to this example, where we have inherited heritable retinoblastoma, the boy inherited the RB1 alteration from his mother, and the first one in this family was the boy's grandmother. So this is inherited heritable retinoblastoma and accounts for approximately 10% of heritable retinoblastoma. So just a few slides regarding or about this unfortunate risk of second primary cancers in heritable retinoblastoma. This is a Danish man. He's 40 years old today. He was diagnosed with bilateral retinoblastoma 2 years old. Everything went as it should, uncomplicated. But unfortunately, he had a sarcoma of his tibia, only 19 years old. Everything was treated the way it should. He has a prosthetic leg. And then later on, unfortunately, 35 years old, he was diagnosed with malignant melanoma. So here's an example of a bilateral RB survivor with not just one second primary cancer, but another third primary cancer. And again, just to understand the genetics behind what is going on, he already has the mutation in all his cells, so one break is left working, the other one is already not functioning well. And this is just to show in the timeline. I use this quite often with other details when counseling the families about how the risk for RB is high in childhood, and then the risk for second primary cancer increases with age, like the risk we all have for a cancer to develop. So, very important to remember that unilateral retinoblastoma indeed can be heritable. So if you ask, should I do genetic testing or surveillance of children if I had unilateral retinoblastoma, the answer would be yes. It's very important to find out. And retinoblastoma only develops when both mutations or both genes have a mutation. Heritable retinoblastoma can be sporadic, like we see most often, but of course it can be inherited from a parent. And genetic testing is extremely important to find out whether you have heritable retinoblastoma, but also the sensitivity of genetic testing is important. There's big differences in sensitivity, and by knowing about sensitivity, we can adjust management. Yeah? So remember the breaks.
Thank you so much, Pernille. That was perfect. All right, and now it's my turn again. All right, so again, I am Melissa. I'm a bilateral survivor. I was treated at Mass Pioneer in 1976. Ooh, it's getting to be a while ago now. I was enucleated on the left, and then I had cryotherapy on my right. And I wanted to talk today about something that I talk about all the time, is pregnancy. I'm a prenatal genetic counselor. So I'm going to talk briefly about the options to consider ahead of pregnancy. So we retinoblastoma survivors, we don't have the luxury of not thinking about this ahead of time, because there are impacts to pregnancy, and we need to kind of think this through or be prepared ahead of time. And so just as a review of a little bit about what Pernille just went through, some important things with pregnancy is remembering that if you have an RB1 mutation, or that there's a 50-50 chance of passing it on. Pernille showed you those chromosomes. We have 2 copies, but it's 50-50 chance which one goes into the pregnancy. So bilateral survivors, Pernille also went through that, so we got to think about it as, it's a pretty high chance that we are going to be able to have that 50-50 chance of passing things on. Unilateral survivors, we're going to have to do some more homework. Actually, for both, we have to do homework, but for unilateral survivors, it's a little bit more complicated, and so really important to check into this ahead of time as well. And yeah, it's just the 18 to 95% chance if you have multiple tumors in one eye, and then it's about an 18% chance that you could have that heritable retinoblastoma that you could pass on to your children if you just had one tumor in one eye. So it's kind of helpful to lay it out there. So when we have to think about, even before a child is a twinkle in your eye, there's some things we need to do. And actually, even parents in this room right now, if you have a child with retinoblastoma and you had genetic testing for your child, make sure you have a copy of that test. Keep that. We are treated as children, and then we get to be adults. I was 20 and went, I never had any testing. What is this? And we know more, and we can use that knowledge. That knowledge is powerful, but it's really tough for some folks that are like, I had something when I was a kid. I was unilateral. I don't really know, right? Because sometimes it can feel like that's past history, but for many of us, this is something that's with us in our entire lives. And so hold on to that test result and make sure. Back in the day, we didn't have these electronic medical records, but it's really important to have a copy of your test results. Now, what if we don't have a copy? What if, like me, you never had testing? And you can go to a cancer center to where maybe you're getting your survivorship care. You can see a cancer genetic counselor, and they can walk you through that testing. Pernille mentioned sensitivity. Like, it's really important to make sure you have a really good test done, especially if you're unilateral and we're like not quite sure what's going on. If you get a positive test result, we know what's going on. In genetics, if we get a negative, we're like, oh, were we looking in the right place, or is it really not there? So it's a little more stressful as a genetic counselor when we don't find anything, although it's a little bit of relief too, and be like, maybe we're done. And so, yeah, so I put a link in here of how you can find a genetic counselor. You also have 2 genetic counselors here at the conference, which is wonderful. So feel free to use me if you're like, hey, I kind of need to do this, come see me. I will be around, and we can talk things through and try to find the best place to get you more information. And I have a link to the National Society of Genetic Counselors website in the US. That's a great option to also find for folks that are not here to necessarily talk to me. So then, before pregnancy, we need to think about what are our goals. So what are the goals as a family, as a survivor, with your partner, having these somewhat difficult conversations at times. Is my goal to not pass on retinoblastoma to my children, or is my goal to have early detection of retinoblastoma to have the best possible outcome for my child? And so both of those are possible with planning. So the key is planning. Yeah, and so there's some things that I'm gonna briefly tell you about is IVF with PGTM, prenatal diagnosis, and then ultrasound or MRI late in pregnancy. And it's gonna be important to find a center that can help you achieve your goals. Not every place where you might go for pregnancy care is gonna be able to handle us. And we're a little bit of a zebra. We don't see us every day, and so we need to make sure we go to a place that can give enough time to find a place that can help us through this process. So IVF and PGTM, really briefly, IVF is in vitro fertilization. PGTM, we used to call it perinatal genetic diagnosis, but they changed it to pre-implantation genetic diagnosis, and now it's pre-implantation genetic testing. The M stands for Mendelian, which is fancy genetic language for a single gene condition like retinoblastoma. So it can be done for lots of different conditions, not just retinoblastoma. So what they do is females typically have 1 awesome egg a month, and you take medication to grow lots of eggs to make them all mature all at once. You have a small surgery to retrieve those eggs. You fertilize the eggs and grow those embryos in a lab. So that's a picture here of an embryo at day 5. It's called a blastocyst. So they're able to do a biopsy of the blastocyst, test the cells to see, is there a retinoblastoma mutation inherited there or not? And so the green in this picture shows ones that are not. Those are the ones that would typically transfer. Now, this all sounds amazing and was something that I was super excited about when I was going to have children. I did go through this process, so I'm happy to answer questions in the Q&A or more privately throughout the conference. It's a bumpy road sometimes. Sometimes it's just easy, and sometimes, just like life with retinoblastoma, it's not. And so I had to do many different, we call them cycles, before I was able to have my healthy twins. They're identical twins, by the way. I put in 1 embryo. Surprise! But they're doing great. And so this is actually, so happy to talk that through if that's something that people are interested in. And in the US, actually, things are starting to change about having more coverage for this. This is tough in the United States for a lot of folks because it is very expensive. But California is recently passing laws to require more access to this type of care. So I'm hopeful, we're not quite there yet, but I'm hopeful this will keep getting better. Very different in places throughout the world. Some places don't have this at all, and other places have National Health Service where you have more access to this. I hope we all will in the future if we have our choices that we would like. So then we can also do prenatal diagnosis, which is something that I talk about all the time. We have an earlier test called the CBS, which is really a placenta test, which is useful for folks that want to test a pregnancy and will find out earlier. That's done between 12 and 14 weeks, and that can help folks who are thinking they might want to end a pregnancy. And And then more often amniocentesis is what folks think about. That actually is a test of the amniotic fluid with the needle that's shown here. We get that fluid, those are fetal cells that we can test for retinoblastoma. Is that mutation there or is it not there? And that can help us get the best care. That can help us not have to do a whole bunch of exams under anesthesia if we know, oh, it's not there. And then if it is there, then we can get the best possible care from the very get-go to make sure we have the best possible outcome for the child. And then some folks, that needle's really not that, it's something we really want to do. So we're starting to, in some major medical centers, to have MRI and ultrasound later in pregnancy. There was a study back in 2016 that showed if you did early term delivery, if we look at earlier, before delivery, that we can increase the likelihood of infants being born with no detectable tumors and stay on top of it and catch them. And so we can use less invasive procedures, just have a better course for these little ones. And so that's actually really important to think about, is that, okay, got to get a team in place that can do this for me. That's actually really challenging if you're already late in pregnancy, later in pregnancy. Those weeks fly by. And so it's super important to see, like, can I actually get a center that can help me? And it might mean you have to travel a little bit. You might have to find the right people that can provide that care and advocate for yourself, because unfortunately, they're not going to offer you these things. We are the experts in our retinoblastoma, and we have to actually go and try to get that care for ourselves sometimes. And I'm happy to help if I can. Okay, and I didn't talk fast enough. I'm going to do it to Molly. Let me move over to Molly now. Thanks so much, everyone.
Thank you, Pernille. All right. Hi, everyone. My name's Molly, and I am going to be talking about RB genetic testing, some take-home messages that I'd like you to remember from this presentation. So what I'll cover today is what is genetic testing. We'll talk about the logistics of genetic testing, why genetic testing is important, and then some key takeaways. So genetic testing can mean many different things. There isn't just one singular genetic test. And when we're talking about genetic testing for the RB1 gene, we're often talking about something called sequencing, where we're reading through each letter of the gene to make sure it's spelled correctly. As we've heard before, there's other families that might have a deletion of the RB1 gene, where the whole gene is missing on one copy of that chromosome, and the genes around it could also be missing. In that case, sequencing would not be the best test to test for that. There's a different test called a chromosomal microarray, which is a test that's used to detect extra or missing pieces of DNA. So I just want to highlight that genetic tests can mean different things, and it's really important, as Melissa said, to keep a copy of the genetic testing that you've had or that your child has had, so that your healthcare providers can know exactly what testing was done. And that's also important because technology changes over time. So the genetic testing that was considered standard 20 years ago is not the same genetic testing that we're ordering today. And so it's really important to check in with your healthcare providers over time to see how things might change and if different testing becomes available. In the US, now tumor genetic testing is a very common practice if a child undergoes enucleation, which is where we will look for the specific genetic changes in the tumor tissue itself to see if we can find out why that tumor developed. We can then use that genetic testing results to compare it to someone's blood genetic testing or saliva genetic testing, like fitting the pieces of a puzzle together to really determine, is this heritable retinoblastoma or is this not? For genetic testing logistics, this will depend on where you're located and what lab is being used, but most of the time genetic testing is a test that's done on a blood sample. Sometimes it can be done on a saliva or a buccal swab, which is a cheek swab. Also in the US, you might have to get insurance authorization, which your healthcare provider would do for you, but this will depend on specifically your insurance plan and where you're living. The turnaround time also depends on what lab you're using, but in general, it takes about 2 to 6 weeks to get results back from when we send a sample out to when we get the report back to us. And as Melissa said, really important to keep a copy of those test results saved on your computer at home in a folder at home so that you can give them to your child or have them for yourself for the future. So now that we know what genetic testing is, why is it important? And there are 3 main reasons I'll talk about today. The first is to determine whether somebody has heritable or non-heritable retinoblastoma. So as we've already learned today, about 18% of people with unilateral retinoblastoma have the heritable form. And so genetic testing can be really important. It's crucial for us to determine whether somebody with unilateral retinoblastoma has heritable retinoblastoma or not. As Melissa said, when we get a negative result, that's good news, but can also be complicated, because even when we get a negative genetic test result, we can't with 100% certainty say that there's no genetic mutation there. And so that's another reason why knowing what genetic testing has been done can be really important. For people with bilateral retinoblastoma, genetic testing is still incredibly important, but we know that everyone, or we assume that everyone with bilateral retinoblastoma has heritable retinoblastoma, even if we can't find the RB1 genetic change. The second reason why genetic testing is incredibly important is because it can inform your surveillance plan. So for somebody who has heritable retinoblastoma, and we know that they're at an increased risk of developing retinoblastoma, their healthcare team would probably recommend exam under anesthesias, or EUA, which is getting a closer look at the back of the eye to look for any signs of retinoblastoma. And we know that people with heritable retinoblastoma have an increased risk for secondary cancers, starting in adolescence and through adulthood. And the main secondary cancer risks that we see are osteosarcomas, which are often called a bone cancer, soft tissue sarcomas, and melanoma. Right now, there are no specific guidelines for what screening should be done for these secondary cancers. And so it really depends on your healthcare provider, your specific case, and where you're living about whether or not considering something like a whole body MRI to look for signs of developing tumors is recommended, or whether some people think that that's not recommended and there's always the chance of false positives or false negatives that can both be really stressful. So that's definitely something to talk about with your healthcare team. And the last reason why genetic testing is really important is because it helps us do targeted testing for family members. So once somebody with retinoblastoma has had genetic testing and we have found the RB1 genetic change, we know exactly what to test for in family members. This is often a cheaper, faster, less expensive test than looking through the whole RB1 gene for any genetic changes. And then, once we've been able to test family members, we'll know whether family members should do screening and have the increased risks of retinoblastoma and other cancers, or whether those family members test negative and they don't need to do the increased screening. And as Melissa said, it's also important for family planning to open up options in terms of genetic testing during pregnancy or before pregnancy if that's something that you're interested in and want to plan for. So the key takeaways are that genetic testing can help clarify you and your family members' risks of cancer. It's really important to keep a copy of you or your child's genetic test report and to check in periodically with a genetic counselor or geneticist every few years. I typically say every 3 to 5 years is sufficient for updates because we're constantly learning more. And here are some helpful genetic resources links that have information about the genetics of retinoblastoma and also resources for both parents and survivors. And I would like to thank, Melissa and I would like to thank Stanford Children's Health, our employer, and also the One Retinoblastoma World Honolulu organization team for putting on such an amazing conference. And then Pernille would like to thank the Danish RB team and the Danish Retinoblastoma Survivors and Families, the International Retinoblastoma Survivors Society, and the One Retinoblastoma World Honolulu organization team. So thank you.
Testing.
Mine's
Let's
live.
see, yours is, oh, yeah, there we are. Okay, so,
We have a few questions that have come in on our virtual program.
okay.
Now, this first one is a few-part question. If a parent is RB1 gene positive, what is the recommended pathway for the baby? Do prenatal genetics counselors discuss prenatal testing? And if they do not get testing, should the baby be referred to ocular oncology immediately for eye exams? Let me know if you need me to repeat any of that.
Yes. So if a parent has an RB1 genetic mutation, and that would mean that the pregnancy has a 50% risk to also have the heritable form of retinoblastoma, we would then say if no genetic testing was done during the pregnancy, that once that child is born, they should be referred to an ocular oncologist for an eye exam and also to a genetic counselor for genetic testing. So we would initiate that screening immediately before we had the genetic test results back, just so that we don't lose any time. But yeah, that's a great question.
And then at my center, from a during pregnancy standpoint, a genetic counselor, like I said, it needs to be at a major medical center usually. Centers of excellence are a great place to be. But you can talk to a genetic counselor about the options during pregnancy. And then if you let them know, like where I work, if we know that the pregnancy is at risk, we consider MRI and ultrasound in that third trimester of pregnancy, so we can have an idea of, are we seeing tumors already that early, things like that. And so we can make a plan for delivery to initiate care as quickly as possible with the oncology folks and ophthalmology, really.
Great, thank you. We have another on our virtual program, but I do want to remind people we have 2 mics up front. If you do have any questions, feel free to make your way up there and ask our panelists. This next question is there research being done on any other genes that may be responsible for RB beyond RB1?
Pernille, you want to take that one?
I don't think I'm the best in this audience, actually, to answer that. I'm looking at Helen and Brenda's group.
Helen, do you want to come up to the mic? Or the question is there research on any new genes that could be a cause for retinoblastoma? It was exciting when McGuinness was found. So that is one that's on the newer side.
Yeah, I think there's not much happening, but I think that what's important is we haven't studied all the genomes of all the retinoblastoma population around the world. So I think there's some exciting research coming out from Kenya. Dr. L.C.G.C is embarking on a project to find out and do genetic testing on retinoblastoma survivors in Kenya. And I think the more we learn about people around the world, we may find new variants in the RB1 gene. I don't think there's going to be much beyond the RB1 gene, but there's a small group of cancers or retinoblastomas where we haven't identified an RB1 gene mutation, and part of those were solved with the discovery of McGuinness. So there is room for more discovery, but not much happening. I think we need to collaborate to study those rare ones around the world. And Brenda, do you have anything more to add? I saw you saying 0, and I think you agree with me, but... Right, so for those online, Brenda says she doesn't think there's another RB1 gene, but yes, for those small ones we don't know, we'll likely solve the answers there, some different small things, she said.
Thanks so much for stepping up, Helen. Please.
Hi, David Fryer from Los Angeles. Fantastic presentations. 2 questions. The first one is for Dr. Gregersen, I think. So pathogenic variants vary in their penetrance, and one pathogenic variant may have less risk for manifestation as a retinoblastoma than another one. My question is, do these pathogenic variants, to your knowledge, breed true over generations, or is there any drift upward or downward in the actual risk for clinical disease?
Thank you. Yeah, that's a really great question, whether you see that variation over generations. So we know about that there is the impact of whether you inherit the pathogenic variant from your father or your mother. a term called genetic imprinting. So of course that would show as a variable pattern of disease, severity of disease in the family. I know there has been some work done about accumulation of more severe disease when looking further down generations, but some of it's work also from Brenda and Helen's groups. Some of the details in it, I still find it as a geneticist struggling to understand, and I'm actually not sure how large a proportion that is of our understanding today, but luckily I see Brenda walking to the microphone. Thank you, Brenda.
Thank you very much. That was very, very broad and informative. I have 2 points. I think to what Helen commented on the RB1 gene is still going to be the very major cause of this disease. But there are all sorts of new things happening, particularly in which parent the gene was inherited from, and the parts of the control of the expression of the gene upstream and even within the gene itself that may make it weaker or stronger. Those are things right on the forefront of horizon. It's very exciting work. But I'd also like to add that in Canada, the standard of care for when a pregnancy is known to have an H1 baby, that means one carrying an RB1 mutation, that child is born at 36 weeks gestation, early term, induced to be born then. 30% will already have a tumor. And that's the standard of care in Canada now for those children. It makes a very, very big difference to the outcomes for the child.
Thank you so much, Brenda. Yeah, unfortunately, folks in the US are not always aware of what's been going on in Canada with the early delivery. So again, that's something that you may have to advocate for if in the future. And I hope that we'll get some more standards that are across, because we've had a lot of survivors in our survivorship group. We do have a Facebook survivorship group, if folks aren't aware. It's for adult survivors that I'm a moderator for. And we've had a lot of folks that have had trouble accessing later term in pregnancy care for their pregnancies that are at risk for retinoblastoma. So, yeah.
But we had one American family that was treated originally, the parent, the first patient or the second generation of the family in Toronto. And they knew about the early delivery, and so they pushed the system, and they achieved an early delivery in the US. But it's the obstetricians who are afraid they'll be sued for delivering a baby early. And that's really something to be really dealt with by this community. Thank you.
I do know that where I work at Stanford, we definitely consider doing that MRI and ultrasound, and that can help us make the case for delivering early, especially if you see something already on an MRI. That was very helpful for getting early delivery at my center. Yeah.
Lynn Murphy did a study on MRI in pregnancy, looking for tumors in the eye, and found 0.
Oh,
and we published one paper, and everyone got all excited because we found it on ultrasound. The ultrasonographer insisted all the pregnancies have ultrasounds for the next 15 years and found 0. So it's not a very effective tool.
Thank
The
you for
tumors
that.
at 36 weeks gestation are intraretinal and very small, would be seen on MRI or ultrasound.
So I guess that brings us back to that paper from 2016 that shows if you deliver early, you catch things early, and you're not going to see it on imaging. So that's the take home. Thank you. Okay.
Thank you so much for your presentations. I wonder if you, as the genetic experts, could give a little bit of advice. You said they should be checking with a counselor. But there were people who know about retinoblastoma and then people who don't necessarily see it. How do you decide what kind of genetic counselor and where you get decent information that's reliable?
And that's before, just when you're a survivor and you don't really know about your...
In general, that business of check with them every 5 years.
Oh, yes. That's a great question. I don't know.
Well, it's really a good question. In Denmark, everything is uncomparable because we have one center at my hospital, so I'm the one that they're checking with for the entire country. But as I said, we only have 4 or 5 new patients every year. So I think I really wouldn't know what advice to give in other systems. I would ask a friend in here that knows a friend that could actually recommend someone to go to.
So I'm a bit of a plant. I'm an ophthalmologist who looks after retinoblastoma. But this idea that every genetic counselor is equal and equally informed, I think is not valid. And so can you tell us, do you have a retinoblastoma interest group amongst genetic counselors or some way of identifying that? Because I think people get quite varying advice and varying expertise from somebody who is a qualified genetic counselor.
That's a great question. And I 100% agree with you. As a survivor myself and someone who is trying to be a resource for folks who are survivors as well, this is challenging. That's why when in my slides I put like at a cancer center, right? Some folks will present to a prenatal genetic counselor. I am a very well-informed prenatal genetic counselor about retinoblastoma, but most folks may never see this in their entire years of practice. And so we survivors are experts, right? And so that's why we wanted to provide those genetic resources that I have there. But I think, to answer your question specifically, folks that are at a major cancer center. So when it comes to retinoblastoma, it can be really tough if you go somewhere and they've never seen retinoblastoma before. It's tough from a treatment standpoint. It's tough from a genetic standpoint. There's a lot. We are rare, and there's a lot that folks who specialize in retinoblastoma can do where other folks are going to be playing catch up. So that's why I was really trying to hit home about taking care of some of these things before pregnancy, because it can be tricky to find the right people, right? So how do I find them? We find them from a cancer center. We find them from our support groups, from talking to me, or also who did the testing for your family, right? Folks move around, so that can be challenging, but the folks that did the testing originally are going to be the folks that you can go back to and be like, hey, how are things going? Like, I need to check in. Or if you are taking your kids into a survivorship clinic, or you have that connection with the original clinic, now that we have ways to talk over the internet and electronic medical records, that's a great way to be able to like check in with the folks who did it in the first place. But I would stress that finding a center of excellence, which I believe is available on the We See Hope website, and finding folks that do have an expertise in retinoblastoma will really help with getting that. Yeah, I think that's a great question, though, because some folks get really lost, and I hope in this age of video visits and telehealth and things like that, that we can get some higher quality care for folks who may not be near one of these centers of excellence. Thank you for the question.
And I will just chime in to add that there is within the pediatric oncology genetic counselors group, there is a special interest group for all pediatric oncology genetic counselors, so we're a very well-connected group. So it might be very hard to find one of us initially, but if you went to a cancer genetic counselor and asked them questions, have you ever had a patient who's had heritable retinoblastoma? Have you seen this before? If not, can you help connect me with somebody who does have experience with this? I think that can help, because we are the genetic counseling community is very good at finding one another in different areas.
Hi, thank you so much. I'm so glad to be here. My name is Andrea Reitzel, and I don't know if you saw my little boy, Alexander. He's 13, and he has unilateral heritable deletion that came with all of these other things, right? Other than just the typical, which I hate to say it's typical. But I just wondered if there were any studies on those kids with deletions that have heritable retinoblastoma deletions on the increased risk of primary and secondary cancers. Because I've been told that, he has a unilateral deletion and he may not have any other cancers. We haven't seen other cancers. So I'm like, okay, I understand that, but they're telling me the genetic heritable
has other primary and secondary cancer. So if he's in this tiny percentage of what, 18% or less of what it is, what does that look like for us going forward? I mean, he has, failure to thrive, epilepsy, a feeding tube. He has all kinds of other issues. And also, I just wanted to mention on this, because we were treated in multiple places, that there wasn't an overarching someone caring for us. So we never saw really our home hospital except for diagnosis. And so my son didn't get a feeding tube until he was 7. And he really should have had a feeding tube when he was 2, but nobody was talking to us. So some of us that have this more complex kiddo, that we don't know how to take care of him or them because they have all of these issues. I totally, whenever I see which is very rare, like I go to the Camp Sunshine, or we're on these RB Moms group, and it's very rare to find a kid like mine in that, and that's fine. I understand that he has, he has special circumstances, but I want to make sure that the next kid that gets treated in multiple places, that doesn't eat, that doesn't feed, that has, seizures that they don't know about, who is helping those families? Like I try to tell everyone, hey, if you see this kind of kid in your community and the parents don't know what to do, send them my way. But also, I, want to know for us, for our future, what it looks like for him. I mean, he's, when we got our genetics testing back when he was 2, they said he would never walk or talk or be out of diapers, because that's the one genetic case that they saw. Right? And that had a similar deletion. So, I mean, he's obviously blown all that away. Yeah. And so I just wanted to say, hey, where is that? And how do I find it? And who can talk to me? And how can we help others that are in our position? Thanks.
Yeah, so that's a really good question, because this is a rare subtype of heritable retinoblastoma where you're missing the entire gene, but also missing neighboring genes. And depending on how many other neighboring genes you're missing, you can get other various problems with, for example, seizures, developmental issues, etc., depending on the size of the deletion. I think the first question you asked, and thanks for sharing this with us, the first question you said, is there also an increased risk for second cancers in your son? So I'll try to be short. There is a huge global study ongoing. They have the center in Amsterdam, and they're going to look into this genotype-phenotype correlation in general. And I definitely expect also to look at these deletions in this study. It's a long timeline because there's a lot of data, but that's the only study that I'm aware of at this stage. In Denmark, we want to look into it as well, but again, the amount of patients with the deletion is small, but because we see such a variable phenotype in these patients with deletions, I find it urgent to look more into it. And of course, there's also other studies on these various features. What I think you probably already know is important to know is that there's this neighboring gene called MED4 that is like a survivor gene. And if you miss that gene, then the tumor cells are less likely to survive. And that is the reason or the explanation behind the higher occurrence of unilateral retinoblastoma in children with the deletion. But for all practical means, at least in Denmark, we take care of children and adults with the deletions as having regular heritable retinoblastoma. So we have some how would I say, we have a survivorship program for all survivors with heritable retinoblastoma, and we see patients, children and adults with the deletion in that program as well. But I'm not sure how it would be dealt with here. But we take all the precautions, even though there might be a lower risk of second cancers. Is that a clear answer?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think it's difficult. You don't want to say, I mean, I think we'd rather err on the side of caution for the secondary cancers. I think that's a good way to put it, is that, and I do feel like genotype, phenotype, meaning like I have this genetic change, what is this gonna look like for me for secondary cancers? And that I don't have great, right? I think that it would be wonderful if we as a community could work together to get more of that information for folks. Like Pernille said, it's really difficult because it's already a rare condition, and then we each have our own differences in the retinoblastoma gene or in a deletion, right? Like what caused what genetic change that we have, maybe the first time it's ever been seen. So just like you experienced, and thank you for sharing that, like it can be really challenging because each kiddo is going to have their own course, is going to have their own, like for me, I had cryotherapy and I kept being checked and I was okay. And it's like, oh, like, does that mean my gene change is kind of milder? We don't know, right? And so I think that's what's so challenging with a rare condition, is that we're not going to be able to say, oh, we have hundreds of these people and have all the statistics and be ready to go. But I do feel like as a community, if we can work together to get that genotype, phenotype information. I thought there was something going on at MD Anderson. If anybody knows about that, let me know. But I think that's something that we could work on as a survivorship group to try to provide more information. And just being available with your lived experience really can help other survivors. It may not be the same course, but but the whole point of this conference is to share things like that so we can support each other through all these different things that we're going through. So thanks again.
We have a question.
And maybe I should just comment. You asked about how to coordinate care. A child like your son in Denmark would need follow-up at a Center for Rare Disorders in order to coordinate all the other ongoing issues. So if there is some kind of Center for Rare Disorders where you're living, maybe there could be a program for him there.
Great. We have a really quick question from Samantha online. And moving forward today, folks, if you want to introduce yourself when you get to the mic, that would be awesome, so we can all get to know who you are and get to know each other better a little more. Okay, from Samantha, could you tell us more about the tumor growth suppressor gene? For a little background, she's a mom of a non-heritable RB fighter who was simultaneously diagnosed with a brain tumor.
Yeah. So I'm not quite sure, is it regarding the second cancer or just in general? So the RB1 gene is a tumor suppressor gene and thus acts like a brake. It controls cell growth. So when it's functioning normally, then you have a normal slow growth of cells. But when it's not functioning normally, then there's uncontrolled cell growth and a tumor develops. But it takes 2 mutations, actually more. It's the first hit and the second hit, and then we actually know it takes a 3rd and a 4th hit for the tumor to develop. So my visualization with the break is very simplified. I don't know if this was answer enough.
It's going to be hard to know.
I hope.
Yeah. And you can go to some of those resources that were on the resource slide if you'd like to go into more detail about the RB1 gene. There's some really great resources there. Yeah. And I think we have a question here.
I'm Helene. I'm a 47-year-old. I had both radiation and chemotherapy. I've had secondary cancers, plural. And I'm just curious, how often should we get genetic testing due to the mutations caused by the treatments that we had, not just our genetic profile?
That's a very good question. And I actually have a few patients in Denmark where we did other genetic testing to rule out, I think you're thinking about, could this be another tumor suppressor gene, like the BRCA1 gene, BRCA2 gene, any other cancer predisposition syndromes? It's a very good question, because what is the limit if it's a cancer you don't expect, if it's a very unusual low age, you see it. For example, in the example I had, the male patient who is now 40, he had a sarcoma and malignant melanoma. I haven't done any other genetic testing
because I think it is because of his RB1 alteration, but should I have done it?
Yeah, so usually I think we think that this is, if we did an adult genetic counseling visit and you know you have an underlying RB1 mutation and it's a cancer that's associated with retinoblastoma and secondary cancers, that's probably your explanation. Is it possible to carry two different genetic conditions? Yes, but that would be very rare. So in general, I would say folks are not going to be going and doing, nowadays we do like a whole panel of genes that you could theoretically do that to make sure there's not something else going on, but you don't have to go, so with your secondary cancer, with your oncology team, you could talk it through with them, but we may be just, it may be that the retinoblastoma plus the treatments really explains your course, but it's not, especially if, say, you had a breast cancer or things like that. You might want to do a little bit more. And so, and you can, and this is again, like as survivors, we're going to have to advocate for ourselves because there are oncology providers who are not experts in retinoblastoma and may not know that this could be a secondary cancer, actually. So it's complicated, and I know we're out of time, unfortunately. So come find us, and there are other folks who are also very experts, and I just want to thank everyone for their wonderful questions and my wonderful panelists, and Helen and Brenda for helping out as well. Thank you so much.